My name is Tiara Bird, and I am the Assistant Director of Career and Personal Development here with VCU's Office of Alumni Relations. Before I introduce our speaker for this evening, I would like to go over a few housekeeping points. So this webinar will be recorded and shared with you all afterwards. So if you missed something, or if you joined late, or if you want us to do a recap, you will be able to view this webinar again at your own convenience in your own time. If you are able to access live closed captioning, that is available. So to access it, you want to locate the closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen. Once you click on that, select Show Subtitles from the menu. If you're having issues with this feature, please message our VCU alumni chat bot for assistance. I would like to thank those that were able to submit questions for our presenter. While registering, we will try our best to get to as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. So you will have a chance to ask questions at the end. So definitely want to hold your questions, and you can use the Q&A feature as well as chat at the end of the presentation. All right, here's the good part. Our speaker for today is Charmaine Curtis. She is an alumna, and she is a career coach and consultant offering comprehensive career development services, combining career coaching and counseling techniques with her corporate recruiting experience. Charmaine helps clients develop tailored action plans to accomplish their goals. She works with clients seeking to explore career options, improve job satisfaction, earn a promotion, change careers, navigate the job search process, and much more. Charmaine is a nationally certified career counselor and holds a master's degree in counseling and psychology, and has years of corporate recruitment and leadership experience. Charmaine, take it away.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction, Tiara. Good evening, everyone. Again, I am Charmaine Curtis, and I am very happy to be here with you all this evening to talk about how you can master the interview process. I first want to start by giving you just a couple of points on the experience that I am bringing to this session this evening. So Tiara talked about my background at a high level, but just wanted to note, again, I am a nationally certified career counselor by the National Career Development Association. And I also have years of experience in recruiting for global organizations, including leading a recruiting team. So I'm bringing a couple of different perspectives this evening, the perspective of a career counselor and coach, as well as the perspective of a recruiter. I currently own Curtis Career Consulting, and I am very happy to be here this evening as a proud VCU alum. I graduated with a bachelor's degree in 2005 in public relations. And yes, I did actually have an opportunity to leverage that degree. So I did start my career in public relations before pivoting to the field of career development and recruiting. I was going to ask who all is in the virtual room, but I did get an opportunity to see you all drop in your graduation dates, things of that nature. So I have a pretty good idea of the mix of individuals who are here with us this evening. All right, so this evening we're going to be focusing on 3 specific areas when it comes to interviewing. The first is preparing for the interview, executing the interview, and then the steps that you need to take once the interview is completed. And then, of course, we want to make sure that we leave some time for your questions. Preparing for the interview. All right, so let's be honest here. Interviewing can definitely be nerve-wracking. I don't really think I know anyone who is not nervous when it comes to interviewing. And I think a lot of that is because it's just not the normal, typical social situation that we are experiencing on a daily basis. The vast majority of people will only interview a few times in their life. So when we're not as familiar with something, it can certainly make us a bit nervous, and it can be stress-inducing. So what I like to do is work with my clients to reframe their thoughts when it comes to interview preparation. So sometimes the pressure that we put on ourselves when it comes to interviewing can be tremendous. So if you're about to go into an interview experience and you're thinking to yourself, I really need to ace this interview or I'm not going to get this job, that naturally will put a lot of stress and pressure on the situation. What I would recommend is just reframing the thought. If you really think about it, an interview is simply a conversation that happens a set amount of time, and it's a conversation designed to give an employer an opportunity to learn more about you and to give you the opportunity to learn more about the employer. And that's really the reality. So if you step back and just think about it that way, it becomes a lot less daunting. As with anything, being prepared is the key to success. I think we all pretty much know that. If you are a good driver, you certainly didn't start out that way. You prepared, you learned the basics of the roads, you practiced driving, and then over years with experience, you got to be the good driver that you are today. If you are a great cook, you didn't wake up a great cook one day. Same idea. You had to learn, you had to prepare, and you practice and gain the experience. The same thing applies with being interview ready. The same exact concept. The more you prepare and the more you practice, the more comfortable you will be going into the interview situation. All right, so let's get you all involved. I have a poll question for you all, and the question is, which one is not a job interview format? And for our options, we have the one-way interview, informational interview, testing interview, or a case study interview. You can see the poll here on the screen if you want to go ahead and select your one choice, which one is not a job interview format. All right, getting some responses in. All right, Tiara, you let me know how we're trending with the poll.
Yes, ma'am. I am going to share the results. Let me know when you can see them.
Excellent. Yes, I can see them. Okay. All right, we have one-way interview is almost 50%. What's interesting is that the correct answer is actually informational interview. We're going to talk a bit more about what a one-way interview is. So all these other options that you see here are actually job interview formats, and we're going to get into the details of what they mean. An informational interview is actually the one that's not a job interview because an informational interview is designed to be just as it sounds. Typically, you schedule this type of interview with someone to learn more about their career path or to learn more about a particular career industry. It's typically like a 15 to 20-minute conversation that serves the purpose of just gaining more info about something. So we are done with that poll. Thank you all for your participation. All right, so let's talk about these different types of interviews. So when it comes to the delivery of interviews, you have a few different scenarios that can come up. The first is the phone interview, and that's typically a screening experience. That's when a recruiter will give you a quick call. It's usually like 10 to 15 minutes. They're asking you very general questions, and that's really to help them determine if they should go ahead and move you on to the next phase, which is typically going to be a hiring manager for the role. Then you have the recorded interview. This is a fairly new interview experience, and it's actually the one-way interview. So essentially what it means is you would log on to the interview platform. You are going to see a question come up on the screen, which will prompt you to respond to that question. There's typically a timer that lets you know how much time you have to answer the question. Talk about pressure. So it's usually a 3-minute window that you get to respond to the question. And in some cases, you will get an opportunity to re-record once, but that does not happen all the time. So you want to make sure if you are participating in a recorded interview experience that you are ready and putting your best foot forward when you're responding to the question the first time. The virtual interview is, I think a lot of us have become familiar with it, especially after, post-COVID, just everything being virtual these days. So it's typically going to be something like a Zoom conversation, Microsoft Teams virtual conversation where you are interacting live with someone on the opposite side of the screen, answering questions and providing dialogue there. The in-person experience, which is my personal favorite, it's just as it sounds. When you go in person to an office to meet with the interviewer, you have an opportunity to meet them live. You get a chance to see the environment that you may work in if you are selected for the role. So that's in person, pretty straightforward there. Now, when it comes to format, there are a few different options for interviews. You have the individual interview, which is just as it sounds. You're interviewing with one individual person at a time. I will say that it's very common for companies to have you interview with two individuals back to back. So if you have, let's say, an hour and a half window, 45 minutes with each interviewer, and that's really just to get a couple of different perspectives about your candidacy for the role. The panel interview is going to be more than one interviewer at the same time. They're typically going to be asking you questions round robin. The one-way interview, we've touched on that. That is a one interaction interview experience where you're being recorded. The testing interview is when there is a very specific skill set that's needed to execute the job successfully. A good example of that is when I was in public relations, I went on an interview. And when you're in public relations, a lot of times when you're working with the media, you have media releases, you have press releases to share important information to be shared with the general public. So when I went on this interview, I had to give them a writing sample. So they basically gave me a scenario, and then I had to write a press release based on the information they provided, because they needed to know that I knew how to do that. I knew the appropriate formatting. I knew the appropriate delivery of the messaging. So that's an example of a testing interview. And then you have a case study interview where you are given a scenario and you walk the interviewer through how you would handle that particular situation with all of the details, the key players involved. And that one doesn't really ask for like a right or wrong answer. It really is just more about thinking, seeing how you think, like how you approach situations, how you manage challenges. So again, not necessarily a right or wrong, but really just understanding more about how you process in the workplace. So getting interview ready. I've said this a couple of times already, but practice, practice, practice. It is essential that you feel prepared and ready for the interview. And the only way to do that is to practice. So a lot of people wonder, like, well, how do I really practice for an interview? Because I don't know the questions that they're going to ask me. And that is very true. We do not have that information, right? But what you can do is practice with a very large number of common interview questions. So if you think about it, if you're practicing all of these different scenarios, providing all of these different responses, there's probably going to be something that you can draw from when it comes to the actual interview questions that are presented to you. So if you think about it, if you have a toolbox and you're building something, the more tools that you have in that toolbox, the easier your build is going to be. Same idea. The more common questions that you've practiced and have responses for, it'll help you to be better equipped when you're going into the interview experience. Use your resources. There are so many resources out there just with a quick Google search. If you have questions about interview process for a particular industry, what are recommendations for things that you can share during the interview in terms of responses? You have ChatGPT, you have all the artificial intelligence out there to help you prepare. And then, of course, you have professional services. I'm like a career coach like myself, someone who can help you with a mock interview or a practice interview, as they're also called. Or you can just connect with a friend and have someone ask you some questions and give you some feedback. So make sure that you're using all of your resources. The other thing of note is to always make sure that you have questions prepared for the interviewer. There is nothing worse than when you have such a fantastic interview with the candidate, and then when you get to the end, they have no questions for you. That sometimes can just represent that they did not think things through. They did not come as prepared. There was no active listening, because a lot of times when someone is interviewing, you're hearing things and you may have some questions that you want to follow up on based on what the interviewer shared, right? So make sure that you're always preparing those questions in advance before you go into the interview, and then leverage your active listening skills to jot down a couple of other questions based on what they've shared. I know this may seem pretty simple, and something that we should know, but please, please, please make sure that you confirm your interview details, double check it, triple check it. I cannot tell you how many times I've heard of or seen situations where a candidate is not in the right place at the right time because they did not pay attention to all of the details. So I urge you to make sure that you are double and triple checking that. Make sure that you bring copies of your interview documents. If you're going to have an in-person interview, obviously, if it's going to be virtual, you can make sure that those are emailed and that you have them ready to send electronically as needed. And then I think something that people get a little nervous with is the idea of going into an interview with notes, right? When I go into any interview, I have a brief list of bullets to remind me of things that I want to make sure that I touch on, or things that I want to make sure I don't forget because I'm nervous, right? So as long as you're not reading from them and using it as a script, it's perfectly fine to have a couple of notes jotted down. And of course, you're going to be taking questions, so you would have that notepad to do so anyway. All right, so when it comes to attire, there are pretty much two options when it comes to interviewing. You have the business casual, and then you have the business professional. And a lot of what you end up selecting will depend on the environment that you're going into. So there are some industries where it's always going to be a bit more professional leaning. If you think about like banking, for example, and then for business casual, maybe education or something like that, right? So understanding the environment and the industry that you're going into for the interview is important. So with business casual, it's pretty, it's a little bit more flexible, obviously. So solid colors is the key. Button down shirts, cardigans or blazers, flats, heels, loafers. You don't have to wear a tie with business casual attire. And then of course, make sure that like you're not overdoing it with like the jewelry and accessories. I think the trick to the business casual for an interview is to have it a little bit of a step above what you might wear business casual like to your office on a Friday, right? So a lot of companies have become very flexible with the dress code, but when you're going for an interview, you always want to dress one level above just to make sure that you're presenting the right attire for the situation. Now, for business professional, I think we all are familiar with that. That's when you're dressed up to the nines, right? You got on your dark attire, your dark suit, dark dress. You typically will have on a jacket, a tie and or belt is very common for a business professional. And then, of course, closed toe shoes, flats or heels, and again, minimal jewelry, and probably, I would say, probably little to no accessories at all for the business professional. So to give you a visual, I did include two images here that have different scenarios. So the photo with the gentleman in blue in the middle, this is more business professional. And then the other photo is more business casual, but for an interview situation. So I know in some companies, business casual means that you can even wear jeans, right? But you wouldn't want to do that on an interview. So I'd say business casual, maybe just a little bit above what the standard is. All right, so getting to the good stuff. Let's talk about actually executing the interview. So carrying it out. Once you're in it, what are you going to do at that point? So in-person interviewing, first and foremost, make sure that you arrive early. Again, we're going to be striving to keep that stress down, keep your nerves down. And if you're rushing and trying to get there as quickly as possible, that's just automatically going to stress you out a bit. You want to go in as calm and prepared as possible. I also encourage you to make sure that you're having positive interactions with everyone. I actually know of a situation where a candidate came in to interview and they were very rude to the front desk staff. And after their interview experience, the front desk staff happened to know the interviewer. They have a relationship, they work together, and they shared that feedback. And as you can imagine, that individual did not get the job. So it's very important to have positive interactions with everyone that you're interacting with on the day of the interview. In general, right? Let's have positive interactions with people. But when you are interviewing, please keep in mind that everyone can be a part of your interview process. Be confident, be positive, and smile, right? Those all sound pretty basic, but they are extremely important. When you come across as confident, people really buy into what you're sharing and what you're saying, right? And to be confident, the best way to do that is to practice and to be prepared, because when you feel like you know exactly what you're doing, you're automatically more confident and comfortable. So, in terms of other things that you can do to come across as confident, making sure that you're giving really good eye contact is extremely helpful, that you have good posture, and that when you're providing responses, they are succinct, right? Because the more clear you are in your responses in your conversation, the more confident you appear. Positivity, we all know, goes a really long way, and so does a smile. It basically presents that you are approachable, and that you could potentially be easy to work with. And that's something that everyone wants in the workplace. Again, I mentioned this on a previous slide, but making sure you have like that notepad to take some notes, have your own notes, jot down some questions. This could definitely come in handy if it's an interview process where there are more than one interview experience as a part of the process. So make sure that you're taking notes so that you know what was discussed in the previous interview and that you're ready for the next. Make sure you request the interviewer's contact information. Obviously, that's how you would be able to follow up with them. And we'll talk about all of the steps that you need to take after the interview towards the end of our presentation this evening. And then, of course, making sure that you thank the interviewer. One thing that I did want to note here is this statistic here. 50% of communication with the interviewer is body language. So how you come across has a big role in how your overall interview experience is. So please keep that in mind. All right, virtual interviewing. So you pretty much prepare for a virtual interview in the same way that you would prepare for an in-person interview, right? So all of those things on the previous slide, you want to make sure that you're checking off the list. Make sure that you're choosing the right location and the right space. So you want to make sure that you're in a quiet space, that it's a neutral space. You don't want too many things going on in your background. You want to make sure that you have good lighting. And then, of course, a critical part of the virtual interviewing process is to test the technology. A virtual interview is not a virtual interview without the technology. So you want to make sure that you get in there a few minutes early, play around with the system, understand how it works. Make sure you read through the directions carefully, because if you, are familiar with using different platforms, sometimes they work better with different web browsers. Like, you may have an virtual interview platform that requires you to use Google Chrome or something like that. So make sure you're reading through all of the directions. Make sure that you are prepared for any technical issues. If you do come across technical issues during your interview, don't panic. One, check to make sure that there isn't already a resource provided to help you troubleshoot. So maybe there's like a phone number you can call, or they have a couple of steps that you can take to troubleshoot. I always encourage my clients to make sure that they are keeping their phone nearby, of course, on silent, right? So it's not disruptive. But sometimes when the technology fails, the interviewer may opt to give you a phone call. And then you may also opt to use the chat feature in the technology if you start to come across some issues. Now, for your virtual presence. So on the previous slide, I talked about how the body language is very important, and that comes across pretty easily when you're in person with someone. When you're virtual, obviously, it's a little bit different. And with the virtual presence, there are a couple of things that you want to keep in mind. One being, look at the camera. That is where your focus should be. You don't want to continuously be looking at yourself because it may look like you're looking away from the interviewer. You want to make sure that you are leveraging the mute button effectively. So if the interviewer is speaking and you are not speaking, you want to make sure that you're muting yourself so that you don't inadvertently interrupt them when they are talking. And then the over talking piece can be a challenge with virtual interviewing because there's a little bit of a lag a lot of times. So you end up like cutting each other off. So a really good way to combat that is to just give it a second until the interviewer stops speaking. And then you'll know that it's your turn to respond because you don't want to seem like you're over talking them and consistently interrupting them. And then, of course, with virtual interviews, you want to make sure that you are minimizing your distractions and any interruptions. So you want to make sure that everyone in your home is aware that you are doing a virtual interview so that they're not coming in and walking in the room. And you also want to make sure, like, if you have a lot of like devices that make sounds, that they're all muted as much as possible to make sure that the distractions aren't happening too much during your interview. And I made a note here that the one-way interviews are gaining traction. So I do want you to start to think about that a little bit more. If you do find yourself having to conduct a one-way interview, there are a lot of resources online to help you prepare for that. And quite honestly, like it's not as challenging as it sounds. What you could do to practice in that scenario is just record yourself responding to some interview questions. So in the same way you would do for in-person with another person live, you can do the same thing by just recording yourself to see how you come across on screen. So I had an opportunity to see a lot of the questions that you all asked in advance of the session, and they were some really good ones. So what I looked to do was take a look at, where we had, common questions, like, multiple people had something similar in terms of what they wanted to know and really tie it into the presentation. So I know we will have time for Q&A, but I want to walk through just some advice and tips and recommendation on how to actually answer interview questions. All right, so before we do that, we have another poll for you all. And the question is, what should be included in the tell me about yourself response? So multiple choice here, select all that apply, where you're from, information about your family, your work experience, your interests and hobbies. Which one should you include in your tell me about yourself response? All right, got some responses coming through. All right, so 95% work experience, excellent. We definitely want to make sure we're talking about the work experience. And when you're looking at the other options, the where are you from, the information about your family, your interests and your hobbies, I actually would not recommend including those in your tell me about yourself. And there are a couple of reasons for that. So we're going to move on to the next slide to talk a little bit more in detail about why that is. All right, so the tell me about yourself, what the employer is looking to learn is about the professional you, right? They want to know what it is that you bring to the role, what your previous experience is, and how you can be successful with their company, right? So a few tips. The first one being this question, I feel like people hear this one a lot, tell me about yourself, but sometimes it can be rephrased to a little bit of a different question. So, sometimes it's like, tell me your story, or, tell me why you're here today, right? And that's all sort of the same setup for this response. When you're responding to this type of question, tell your story, make it engaging, right? Make it something that people can follow along with. But you also want to make sure that you're being succinct, right? Don't overshare, don't share too many details. You don't need to go into details about, where you grew up. You don't need to go into details about your family or anything like that. You will have an opportunity to talk about some of your interests and hobbies potentially at another time during the interview experience. But it is important to note that things like like your family and things like that, like that actually is information that should not be asked during an interview. So you don't want to necessarily offer it up if it's something that's not required or needed for that particular role. Again, we're working to keep everything extremely professional in the interview process. So some topics you can talk about, and if you're thinking about like, hey, how do I tell my story in this response? So you can talk about your current role, how you got to where you are, talk about your strengths, all the passion that you have for the work that you do, why you're interested in the role. And then, sharing an accomplishment is also a really good thing to share during this response. And with this question, it's important to keep it, I would say maybe around 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes at the most, because anything beyond that, the interviewer may start to just lose focus. And this is the first question. So you want to make sure that you're leaving a good impression with this one. All right, behavioral interviews. These are extremely common. I cannot think of an interview that I've heard of recently that did not incorporate behavioral interview questions. And basically, what they are is they are questions designed to understand how you would or how you have responded in a particular scenario. When you're responding to these questions, you're typically telling a story. And when you're telling a story, it can be very easy to get lost and to start to ramble and to start sharing details that aren't necessarily important to what the interviewer needs to know. So one way to rein that in is the STAR method. That's one of my favorites when I'm trying to think through, okay, I have a behavioral interview question. How am I going to frame this? How am I going to explain the details? So STAR is an acronym with the S representing situation. So what you'll want to do is start with setting the scene for them, letting them know what the situation is that you're trying to navigate or that you were trying to navigate. The T is for task. So you want to tell them what the specific task was for you or your role or your responsibility in the situation. You want to talk about next. A for action, the action that you took, not what everyone else did, but the action that you took specifically to address the situation. And then the R is for result. So what was the outcome based on your actions? So a quick example of this, let's say the question is, can you tell me about a time? And that's also a lot of how these questions start. Tell me about a time. So can you tell me about a time when you were managing two competing requests or demands for your time? So let's say I had on my calendar 2 meetings that were happening at the exact same time. I know that I can't be in 2 places at once, so I need to move one of them to another time. So I'm going to look at it. Who is the meeting from? What's the topic? What's the urgency? Is it something that can be moved to a later date and time? So that's the situation. The task is that I need to make a decision on which meeting I'm going to actually move. And then the action is to do that, reach out to the individual that I need to reschedule with, find out their next availability, get that on the calendar. And then the result is that I'm able to accommodate what's needed most urgently with the meeting that I have today, and then address the other one at a later time. So when you're telling that type of story, it can be easy to start like rambling and going into a lot of details that's not really necessary. So the STAR method I do find to be very helpful for these type of interview questions. All right, so getting to what the interviewer wants to know, they want to know your interest in the role. They want to have a better understanding of your experience, like how you're qualified for the role, as well as your skills. So a couple of tips I'd like to give you to make sure that you are prepared for these types of questions. One, you want to make sure that you research the organization, because you'll probably get some questions about why are you interested, and that will require you to know more about the company, right? Make sure that you're thoroughly reviewing the job description, because that will help you to understand like certain keywords. It'll help you to understand the top priorities for the role, the qualifications, and you can make sure that you're referring to the qualifications that you have that match up to the job description. It's also important to make sure that you're highlighting your accomplishments and measurable results. And then think about times that you were recognized. I think that that's also a really good way to help you prepare for some of the questions you may receive from an employer. So you can see a lot of questions here. Obviously, we will not be going through all of these questions due to time, but I did want to touch on a couple that, may present challenges or, can be tough to answer when you're in an interview situation. So let's pick what are your strengths and weaknesses? I feel like this is always a tricky one for people. With strengths, that's pretty easy, right? We all can think of things that we're good at and what we've been recognized for. So that's easy to share during the interview experience. When it comes to the weaknesses, that one can get a little bit more complicated because you want to make sure that the weakness you're sharing is not detrimental to the ability to actually secure the role. So an example of that would be if you're going for a sales job and you say that your weakness is that you really don't like talking to people, you're probably not going to get that sales job, right? So you want to make sure that your weaknesses, number one, that you're honest, but that they don't ruin your chances of securing the job that you want. So an example that I would give, and this is actually, just a personal example, for a long time, something that I've had to work on has been delegation. So as a leader, I want to make sure that my team is set up for success. And one way to do that is to make sure that they're getting a variety of experiences and taking on new challenges. So when I started to think of it that way, that made it a lot easier and quicker for me to delegate because I started to look at it differently. And seeing it as an opportunity for my team to grow and develop, as opposed to adding more workload, things of that nature. So my weakness was delegating, right? So that was something that I needed to work on. And I was able to address that by rethinking how I approach delegation, right? So that's a weakness that could be shared during an interview. All right, so moving on to understanding company and team culture. This is extremely important to employers because hiring the right person is extremely important because when someone does not work out in a role and they have a quick turnover, so they leave the role pretty quickly, what that means is that you have to rehire and that gets very expensive, right? So a company is always going to want to know, how do you fit in with the team culture? And so for you to get an understanding about the company's culture, you can do that by exploring their website, like their mission statement, if they have employee resource groups, their corporate social responsibility, what type of recognition they've received from organizations for their work, like top place for flexibility or top place for working parents, right? So those sorts of things can give you an idea of what the company is all about, culture wise. And then of course you want to make sure that you're prepared to discuss, your preferences and how you work and what's important to you. So some examples are listed here. And if you want to do a screen grab to get the questions, please feel absolutely free to do so. But a question here that I think would be helpful to chat through briefly is, how do you deal with conflict, right? So I feel like that question helps an employer to understand a lot of things, like your temperament, your ability to problem solve, your level of self-awareness, how you work with others. So that question can really help them to get some insight into how you might work out as a member of the team, a member of the company, right? So that's an example of a question that helps the employer to understand a bit more about how you connect to the culture. So the other piece of the question process is understanding what you want to know about the employer, because again, the employer is getting to know you, but you are also getting to know them. So these are a few examples of questions that you can ask the employer. Again, if you'd like to go ahead and grab them from the screen, please feel free to do so. But a question I think we can touch on briefly is, let's see here. So what is the top priority for the person selected for this role? that can definitely give you insight into what you're really getting yourself into. So, if you are interviewing for a role and they say we're looking for someone who can come in and completely turn things around, that may be indication that there are some particular challenges that are happening, right? But if the response to that is to we want this person to get this one particular program up and running, identify participants, that sounds a lot more reasonable, and it sounds like things are under control, potentially in that company, and it may be a good opportunity to move forward with. All right, so we have our last poll here, Tiara. You get us teed up. So what percent of employers say they may not interview a candidate they can't find online? 10%, 25%, 40%, 60%.
Give me 1 second to get that poll for you. All right, give me 1 second. Let me know when you can see it. I want to make sure it's the correct question.
It's the previous one.
Give me 1 second. I apologize, guys.
No worries. No worries. We can also drop responses in the chat.
Can you see this on the screen?
Not just yet.
Okay, give me 1 second. All right, if this doesn't pop up, then you guys can put your answers in the chat. Let's see, let me try it one more time. 1 second.
Yeah, no worries. No worries at all.
It didn't pop up?
No, that's okay.
Yeah,
that's okay.
Use the chat. Sorry about
no
that.
problem. No problem. All right, so see a couple of responses coming through in the chat. So this one surprised me, quite honestly, but it's actually 40%. That was a pretty big number, in my opinion. And I think that this just really, truly demonstrates the importance that people place on culture and connectivity, and like you fit in with the team, work well with the team, because we all know the general idea is to just learn more with that online search, right? So I think that just really brings home the importance of culture within a team and within a company. All right, so we are getting close to the end here. Wanted to touch on a couple of tough topics. So from a good number of you, there were questions related to these topics. So wanted to make sure that we discussed these briefly. So salary, gaps in your resume or experience, and then age, okay? So when it comes to salary, make sure that you do your research, you understand what the going rate is for the work that you do and the city that you live in, okay? So if you're going in with your research, you have your data points, your numbers, you're prepared, you're going to more than likely get a fair offer, right? Because you already know what the expectations should be. Ask for what you deserve. It's always easier to go back and, it's lower. It's easier for a company, sorry about that. It's easier for a company to come back to you with a lower number if you've given them a very high number, right? But if you go in with a very low number, your chances of being able to go in for a higher number later are pretty slim to none. So make sure that you ask for what you deserve. And ask for more time. Consider if you're just not ready to answer that particular question, right? You can let them know, hey, I want to evaluate the entire compensation package. I want to look at the benefits, employee programs that you all have. Can you provide me with that information so I can make an informed decision, right? So there are a couple ways that you can deal with the salary question. Gaps in your resume or experience, you do want to be upfront. You want to be honest. I know that this can be a bit more tricky when there has been termination or, if someone has been let go from a company. And I think it really depends on the specific circumstances, how you can manage that in an interview. But I would say, holistically is just understanding like what the company can share, what the scenario was, and how you can frame it in an interview response. You can also consider different experiences. So maybe you're not working like at a full-time job, but maybe you're doing like some community service work that's related to the industry. So you can think through different ways to respond to the gap. And then also sometimes, a position is just not a good fit. And that is okay, or a company is not a good fit, and that is okay to share. Again, being honest about the gaps is going to be important because you don't want to be in a situation where some information that was not truthful then resurfaces at a later time. And then when it comes to age, so I think this can go both directions. So in some cases, if you have a very young professional who is going for a leadership role, that might their young age may be a barrier to that because they'll be viewed as not having the experience. And then on the flip side of that, if you have someone who has been in the workforce for a long time, they may, there are just different misconceptions there. And so in either scenario, you want to make sure that you're highlighting your value add, like what you bring to the table, what experience you actually have. You don't need to focus on the numbers. So like if you've only been in the workforce for 5 years, you don't need to focus on that. You need to talk more about what you've actually done and accomplished. And vice versa for the more experienced professionals. You don't want to focus on the years, but you want to focus on like, yes, I am bringing a lot of experience, like I'm tried and true. This is what I have to offer. And then in both scenarios, you want to talk about your experience working with a broad range of colleagues. So everyone from the newest generation in the workforce to the retiring generation in the workforce. So a couple of recommendations for managing tough topics. After the interview, very short steps there. Make sure you send a thank you note, follow up as needed, and maintain a positive relationship if you're not selected. So the thank you notes still go a long way. You can email them these days. You don't have to put them in the mail. Follow up is needed. You will have asked the interviewer, as we talked about a little bit earlier, how long should you expect to hear back? That'll give you an idea. If you haven't heard anything, typically within a 2-week period, that's an okay time to reach back out. And then, of course, if you're not selected, you don't want to burn your bridges. Just take it in stride, ask for feedback if they're able to give that to you, and then continue on with your job search process. All right, so we are now at the portion where we can talk a bit more about some questions and how you can learn more. But before we do that, if you are looking for individual services, I am happy to connect. And I offer career coaching and counseling sessions, interview coaching, resume services, career assessments. So you can connect with me on LinkedIn or visit the website. All right.
Awesome.
All right, we're ready for some questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Charmaine. That was a wonderful presentation. Really, really appreciate that. And you covered a lot of information. There were some questions. Let me go back and look through. So there was a question, and the question is Zoom the most common platform for virtual interviews? And are there other platforms that we should familiarize ourselves with?
That is a really good question. I will say that Zoom is the primary platform that's used for interviews. But another platform that's becoming very popular is Microsoft Teams. So it's very similar to Zoom, just ran by Microsoft. And then there's also another platform called HireVue that some companies use. So same concept as Zoom, but that one is specifically for the workforce and for interviewing.
Awesome. Thank you. There was another question. So graduating during the pandemic allowed me to explore many roles, industries through contracted positions that averaged 6 months. Due to this, my resume looks sporadic. How can I communicate my current interest in full-time roles without appearing like a flight risk?
No, that's a really good question. So I think in that scenario, like again, going back to just being upfront, it is perfectly okay on your resume to note if a role was a contract role, like because that naturally indicates that it was for a specific amount of time. Another thing that you can do is just highlight your overall experiences on your resume first. So you can have like a summary of qualifications where you list out all the different skill sets that you have. And that's a section that can be easily tweaked and edited for the specific roles that you are going for. And again, noting the contract piece is understandable. Like everyone, I believe, understands a lot of what happened post COVID with contract work, so that shouldn't present as much of a problem as you think it would. Like it's a very different time we're in now.
Great, thank you. And there was another question in the chat. When should interviews be scheduled when working full-time, as many companies have universal lunch times from 12 to 1? That's a great question.
So, I mean, quite honestly, when it comes to interviewing, I mean, the employers are usually they have full-time work too. So they will present a few times that, could work well for them. But I do know in some cases, there are interviews that happen at like 5 p.m. As well. Like if, you're looking to do something after hours or like later in the day. But then me, myself personally, I don't mind interviewing at 12 p.m. because, I understand that people have work and the lunch break usually a good time to do it.
Right. And the person also had a follow-up question, like,
Okay.
what if the interview had multiple rounds? Round one, round two, round three, meeting with different people. I'm guessing, how would they structure those if they're a full-time employee? Like, should they take the entire day off? What should they do?
I think if it's virtual, obviously that makes it a lot easier to use like, vacation time or personal time off so that you can step away. And I would also say it's probably if you have the option, if you could schedule it for earlier in the morning and, go in a little bit later or schedule it for as late as possible in the evening and then just step away a little bit earlier. So it's not as impactful to your workday.
Thank you. And then another question is, how do you display confidence during the interview when applying for jobs that are more senior level, which would be new for you?
So again, that goes back to being prepared, right? Practicing your responses, knowing exactly what you're going to say, understanding what you bring to the table, what leadership abilities do you have, what measurable results have you been able to produce in the workforce, right? So with leadership, a lot of it is the outcomes that you can produce and how you help others grow and develop. So I would say coming in with those examples, being able to share exactly what you've done in the past. And if you get a question and you have not experienced it yet, you could always share what you would do in that particular scenario. So again, goes back to like not really talking about the number of years of experience that you have that may not have you on paper like ready for that leadership role, but it's your direct experiences.
Awesome. Thank you, Charmaine. We do have a couple more. I know we
Yeah.
have 5 minutes until 7, so thank you all for sticking around with us and being patient. Excuse me. So what are your recommendations for interviewing for different positions at the same company?
Well, I would say number one, I wouldn't recommend interviewing for more than two with the same company because that can come across as like you're just applying for anything and not really being strategic in your job search. But a lot of times the company will know, they'll know that a candidate is being considered for multiple roles, and I actually have seen that. And so what another common thing that happens during interviews these days is that employers will ask like, are you considering other opportunities, so that they understand how quickly they need to turn around a decision for you. So it's okay to share that. Like, I mean, they're all in the same company anyway. And it does happen, but I would say two should be the max on that.
Okay. Thank you. We did have another one, and it's how can I avoid becoming nervous and how to leave a lasting impression? And I know you touched on this a little bit earlier, but I didn't know if you wanted to add anything additional.
Um, so I would say again, it goes back to if you are a good cook, you have to practice. You have to have the experience. You have to be comfortable with it. The best way to not appear nervous and to have confidence is to practice, practice, practice. And again, going back to that, if you practice a number of common interview questions, 9 times out of 10, you're going to have something ready to go for whatever they ask you.
Awesome. Thank you. The next question is, or a statement, say if I got denied the position, but I really, really want to work for the company, what are things I could do to further show my interests?
Yeah, so if you are denied, one of the things that you can do, and it depends on the company, you can ask them for feedback. So some companies will be able to offer that and some will not, right? And I think also that opportunity, so when you send the thank you note, that's an opportunity to re-express your interest in the role. And then at the point of not actually securing the role, I think it's perfectly fine to reach out to the interviewer and, thank them again for their time. You understand that it was not the right time to join the company based on, whatever the circumstances may be, but that you are interested in potential future opportunities.
Thank you. And I'm looking in the chat. I see there are more questions in the chat. Someone asked if it was okay, asked if it was required, to share your salary at your current role if the interviewer asked. That's a great question.
Yeah, so some of that depends on the state that you're in, because there are certain laws that apply in different states related to salary disclosure. So that could depend. But if you are being asked, like in the interview, like, what is your current salary? I think going into the interview, like, understand, is that something that you want to share or not? Because if you do, okay, that's easy. If you do not, what is the reason for that? And then coming up with an appropriate response based on those circumstances. So that one can be a little bit more individualized.
Okay. And I don't think that's ever happened to me, but that was a great question. Another question in the chat popped up, and this will more than likely be our last question. Being a recent grad, is it still okay to include coursework related to the position applied for on my resume? It's a great question, William.
I would say for maybe the first year after graduation. Beyond that, I think you can move away from that.
Um, all right, that was our last question. We are at 6:59, so we have like 1 minute left. Thank you all for your great questions. This was a fantastic presentation. And Charmaine, thank you so much for providing your experience and your knowledge and expertise on interviewing. And I hope everyone has gotten some great information that's going to prepare them for their next interview. As I mentioned earlier, Charmaine is one of our coaches. She is a career coach. So if you guys need assistance with career exploration, career changes, job satisfaction, career assessments, resume, so much more, please contact Charmaine. We can send you her contact information if you'd like it. Also, a recording of this will be sent to you all. So in addition with her contact information, if you guys have enjoyed tonight's conversation, we encourage you to check out more events on our website. So a link to our website should be in the chat currently. And also we have a survey. We value your feedback. We want to create more programs with you in mind, things that interest you. So a survey is also in the chat. And if you do not catch the survey in the chat, that will also be sent to you along with the recording. And on behalf of VCU Alumni Relations, thank you so much, Charmaine. I hope you guys have a fantastic Thursday night and a great evening and weekend.